Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to talk today about the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team, and that team accomplished more than winning a hockey gold medal. They basically helped freedom defeat communism. In the 1970s, it was not, by and large, a good time to be an American because, particularly in the late 70s, Iran held hostages at the overthrown U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Those hostages were held for 444 days. Nixon resigned as president because of the Watergate scandal. It was just not a good. It was just not the most proud time to be an American. And in the 1970s as well, the Soviets upset the United States in basketball and won the gold medal. And our hockey team had been falling apart for years because the Soviets had won the gold medal in 64, 68, 72, 76. So the Soviets were going for their fifth gold medal. Okay, the Disney movie Miracle talks about the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team. Kurt Russell stars as the coach, Herb Brooks, and that's a really good movie. Also, The Boys of Winter is a really good book, and I recommend that book as well. All right, okay, Herb Brooks' 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team. 9 of the players were from the University of Minnesota. That's where Herb Brooks had coached. Herb had won 3 national championships with the Minnesota Golden Gophers, and 4 of the players were from Boston University. There were some players from University of Minnesota Duluth and the University of North Dakota, the University of Wisconsin. But Herb Brooks was in the picture of the 1960 U.S. Olympic team. But a few days before the games were set to begin, Coach Jack Riley, who coached the 1960 U.S. Olympic hockey team, he called Herb Brooks into his office and said, "You're cut." And Herb Brooks was the last person to get cut. And so when the U.S. was winning the gold medal in 1960, he was on the couch in his home with his father, Herb Brooks Sr., and watching the game and saw the U.S. win the gold medal. And Herb Brooks Sr. told his son, "Looks like Coach Riley cut the right guy." So Herb Brooks Jr., the coach of the 1980 U.S. Olympic team, used that as motivation to never flinch in the face of adversity. So he applied for the 1980 Olympic coaching job. That was not their first choice. The first choice was Bill Cleary, a guy from the 1960 U.S. Olympic hockey team that went on to win the gold medal. But he declined, and another guy declined. So Herb Brooks was the third choice. Herb Brooks got the job. And there was a lot of tension between people from the Midwest and people from the Northeast. The people from the Midwest believed in hard work. They were optimistic. They believed it's all going to work out in the long run. And the people from the Northeast were a lot more cynical. They were a lot more flashy, a lot more sharp-tongued. All good people, just different cultures. And people from Minnesota and the Midwest, they didn't leave. They left their wallets in plain sight. They didn't lock their doors at night. The people from Boston were thinking, what's wrong with these people? These hicks from the cow pasture? And so Herb Brooks designed a system where he was going to be the evil guy. He was going to be like the Ayatollah, where everybody would hate Herb Brooks and not hate each other. And that was Herb Brooks' system. And Herb planned everything. He did everything for a reason. And the players from Boston University were Jack O'Callahan. He was a defenseman of Irish Catholic origin. He grew up in Charlestown, Massachusetts. He attended Boston University, and he was a defenseman with an attitude. And then Michael Eruzione, he was the team captain, and his name in Italian meant eruption, and that was his personality. And then Dave Silk was from Boston University, as well as the goalie, the starting goalie, Jim Craig. The backup goalie, Steve Janicek, he was from the University of Minnesota. So the players thought Herb Brooks' practices, except the Herbies, that's where you skated basically across the rink for conditioning. But other than that, the practices were fun because you could move in certain places. You didn't have to stay in a position. You had a lot more freedom with the puck. But he was hard on the players. So, and he had sayings, and a lot of them were bad jokes and bad sayings. Like if 2 players were fighting, he said, "You look like 2 monkeys humping a football," whatever that means. And if he would tell one guy, "You're playing worse every day, and right now you're playing like it's the middle of next week," and the players would quote him and put it in a little notebook, and they called them Brooksisms. They laughed at the jokes because they were scared he'd skate them to death. So they played a lot of exhibition games, and some games were really good, some weren't. They beat Harvard, the Harvard University hockey team, but at the same time, they lost 9-0 to the St. Louis Blues. One of the worst ones, though, was Team Norway. Norway's excellent at skiing. They're excellent at a lot of things. But as far as hockey goes, I've talked to people in the Norwegian Air Force before, and they just say that they know what it is. They have hockey, but they're not really good at it overall. And they tied the Norwegian team, 3-3 in an exhibition game in Oslo, Norway. And the Herb Brooks said, "You're not going to play in the game. We'll play now." And they did an hour's worth of what you would call Herbie skating across the rink for conditioning purposes. They did 45 minutes to an hour's worth of Herbies. Now, Jim Craig didn't do them because that was one of the few games he didn't play in. And Buzz Snyder actually got thrown out for fighting. So he was in the locker room wondering where everybody was. And then he goes out, and then he sees what they were doing, and then he puts on his hockey gear, and Coach Craig Patrick, the assistant coach, said, "Don't worry about it, Buzz. Don't worry about it. Go back to the locker room." So, but then the next day, they played Norway, and they won 11-0. That was the wake-up call. In 1979, they didn't have the Olympics, but they had these World Games, and the U.S. won the World Games. They beat the Soviet B team 5-3 and won the gold medal for the World Games, but Herb Brooks still wasn't satisfied with the performance because Herb Brooks was that much of a perfectionist with a lot of things. And in 1980, the U.S. came close to losing to Sweden. They were down 2-1 with less than a minute to go. And then Bill Baker, a player from the University of Minnesota, who's now a facial surgeon, he scored the tying goal, so the U.S. was in pretty good shape. And Sweden is a powerhouse hockey team, usually year after year. And then the next game, the U.S. in the Olympics, the next game they beat Czechoslovakia. And they beat them 7-3, and Czechoslovakia was predicted to win the silver medal that year. And the U.S. kicked the crap out of them. So the U.S. started catching people's attention. They were like, whoa. What's up with these guys? These are college kids. Because during that time, pro athletes, particularly in hockey, but in other sports too, but particularly in hockey, were not allowed to play in the Olympics. The Soviet players were amateur in name only. They were NHL type talent. The Soviets, the state controlled the whole sports system, though. And so these players were in the military. Like the captain of the Soviet team, Boris Mikhailov, he was technically a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Army, but he did no military training. His job was to play hockey for the Soviet Union. And that's basically all they did. All they did was play hockey. Almost no time for friends, no time for family. Vladislav Tretiak, who's a legendary goaltender, he was the Soviets goalie during the 1980 Olympics. He even trained on his wedding day. He said he didn't complain about it because he loved hockey and he thought that's how it ought to be, but it just consumed your life. That's what it was over there. They had a coach, Viktor Tikhonov, and Tikhonov rarely smiled. And the Soviets, when they scored a goal, they rarely smiled. It's like they were just used to it, because they had been winning so many hockey gold medals. All right, back to the Olympics. Then where it was a scare for the U.S. team, though, was Germany almost beat them, West Germany, when Germany was divided during that time at East and West Germany. West Germany almost beat them, and it was almost a huge problem for the U.S., but the U.S. came back and won 4-2. Okay. All right, now let's get to the... the Soviet. Before the Olympic Games, the U.S. played the Soviets and at Madison Square Garden in an exhibition game, and they lost 10-3. And Al Michaels, who did commentary for that game, 10-3 made it sound closer than it was. It could have easily been 20-3. I mean, the U.S. players had their mouths like that, and then they applauded the Soviet players because they were that good, and it was something the U.S. players had never seen before. Because also earlier that year, the Soviet Union beat the NHL All-Stars in a 3-game series and won all 3 games. In the third game, they won 6-0. But in the Olympic game, the U.S. wins 4-3. Now, Buzz Schneider scored the first goal for the United States, and Buzz Schneider played on the 1976 Olympic team. But Buzz Schneider did well against the Soviet goaltender Vladislav Tretiak. They had World Games mostly every year. So in the World Games, one time the U.S. lost to the Soviets 4-3 in the mid-1970s, and Buzz Schneider was on that team, and he had a hat trick against Vladislav Tretiak. Schneider basically owned Tretiak. But, okay, then the Soviets took, when Schneider scored, it was a 1-1 game. The U.S. tied it at 1. And then right before the first period ended, Mark Johnson scored. Mark Johnson scored. And he was the best player on the U.S. team as far as he wasn't particularly fast, but he could, or particularly the most agile, but he could play any sport. So he was the best overall player. So Mark Johnson, with about 1 second remaining, the Soviets got too relaxed. Dave Christian took a long shot to the goal, and Tretiak kicked the puck easily. I mean, he blocked it with his padding, but Johnson comes in and then scores on Tretiak with 1 second left. So at the end of the first period, it was tied 2-2. Then at the end of the second period, the Soviets made it 3-2. But then in the third period, the U.S. Mark Johnson tied the game, and then Michael Eruzione scored the fourth goal. The team captain. Eruzione was the team captain. That was Herb Brooks' choice, and Eruzione and his had a very erupting personality. He's of Italian descent, and his last name in Italian means eruption, and that was his personality. Now, like I said, the U.S. did amazing things. They and the U.S. players will tell you this: they did not make the Berlin Wall collapse. They did not do any of that, but they made the nation believe. And the 1980s was a lot higher time of patriotism than the 70s. American exceptionalism was back. People were proud to be Americans, and the U.S. Olympic hockey team helped lift the spirits for that. They got a telegram right before the game for the Soviets. They got a telegram from a lady from Texas that said, "Beat those commie bastards." Now, after the U.S. beat the Soviets, they had to play Finland. Now, the way the system was set up, if the U.S. lost to Finland, particularly if they lost to Finland pretty badly, not only could they not win gold, they may not win a medal. So the U.S. was down 2-1 going into the third period, and they scored three goals in the fourth period. 3 goals in the third period to defeat Finland. So they came from behind in every game in the 1980 U.S. Olympics. Now, some games they won really big, some games they did not, but they had to fight from behind each game, including the time they played Norway in the Olympics. They beat Norway 5-1, but Norway ended up scoring first. So, the Finland game, Herb Brooks talked to his players, said, if you lose this game, you're going to take it to your effing grave. Then he almost walks out the locker room and looks back and says, your effing grave. And the U.S. won 4-2. They were down 2-1 a lot of the game, but they were determined to win the gold medal. And Eruzione, because he was captain, he went up to the podium to receive the gold medal to stand on the post. But right when he got his gold medal, he called the entire team up there because it was definitely a team effort. It was the team against Herb Brooks the way Herb Brooks wanted it. That it didn't matter at the end of the day. It didn't matter where people were from, the Midwest or the Northeast. There was regional tensions at first, but Herb Brooks stopped that and made him public enemy number one. Herb Brooks loved his players. He just didn't show it all the time. He unfortunately, right before the movie Miracle was released in theaters in 2004, Herb Brooks passed away. He was not one to wear seatbelts just because he was very set in his ways, and he was coming back from a golf tournament, and his car flipped, and he died in a car wreck. And all the players were at the funeral except Mark Pavelich. Mark Pavelich was at the visitation at the wake the night before, but Mark Pavelich was just a very reclusive individual. But it was no disrespect to Herb Brooks. So, anyways, God bless the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team for all they did. So, anyways, hope everyone's doing well. Take care. God bless them. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.